What if the very language you spoke every day was never truly yours, but a chain left behind by those who once ruled over you? What if, after more than 120 years, a single decision shattered that chain in front of the entire world? Could a young leader's bold move to silence the voice of a former empire become the spark that rewrites the destiny of an entire continent? What if I told you that one of the poorest nations in Africa, a land often overlooked on the world stage, dared to do something that even the wealthiest and most stable countries have never attempted? What if a leader, not even 40 years old, stood up and decided to break a chain that had silently bound his people for more than 120 years? Most of us would imagine such a country to cling to safety, to follow the familiar path, to hold tight to the structures imposed by former colonial powers just to survive. Yet, against every expectation, Burkina Faso did the unthinkable. Its young president, Ibrahim Traoré, declared that French would no longer hold the sacred place of national language. He chose to take a step so bold, so shocking, that it sent ripples of surprise across continents. This is not just a story about a language. It is a story about defiance, about breaking free from invisible shackles that have strangled generations. Imagine carrying the voice of someone else in your mouth for over a century. Every law, every classroom, every conversation stained by the shadow of a foreign tongue. That tongue was never truly yours, yet it ruled over you like a silent master. And now, in one swift decision, a leader has declared that those chains will no longer define his people. I find myself reflecting on the courage it takes to make such a choice. This is not the cautious path of diplomacy, nor the safe choice of conformity. It is a gamble against history itself. Most leaders in similar positions would say, "Let us wait, let us maintain stability, let us not disturb the fragile balance." But Traoré said no. He decided that his people must stand tall on their own feet, with their own language, their own identity, their own future. Think about the timing. France is consumed by challenges elsewhere, distracted by conflicts and crises that stretch its influence thin. Many would see this as the perfect opportunity to quietly build independence, to slowly carve out a new space while keeping appearances intact. But Traoré did not choose quiet resistance. He chose to strike with a roar, making a statement that cannot be ignored. By doing so, he has turned Burkina Faso into a symbol far larger than its borders, a beacon for all of Africa and beyond. When I first read about this decision, my mind kept returning to a haunting question. If in just 1 year after France left, Burkina Faso could earn $19 billion from its own mineral wealth, then how much did this nation lose in more than 120 years of foreign control? Trillions, perhaps, or even more. And more than wealth, what about dignity? What about pride? What about the belief in one's own ability to stand unchained? That is the deeper wound, the invisible loss that cannot be measured in numbers. Some will argue this is reckless. They will say languages are not chains, that French carries advantages in law, in trade, in diplomacy, in science. And on the surface, they are right. But beneath that logic lies a harsher truth. Every word spoken in that foreign language was a reminder that true independence had never fully arrived. It was a ghost of colonialism, whispering in every classroom and every government hall. And ghosts are powerful because they linger in silence, convincing you that you are free while they quietly remind you that you are not. To me, the true shock is not that Traoré made this decision, but that no one else before him dared to. Many African nations, long after independence, still cling to French as their official language, as if afraid to anger the memory of their former master. It is easy to call this pragmatism, but perhaps it is simply fear dressed in logic. Traoré cut through that fear. He did what others only whispered about. He tore away the mask and declared that his country will no longer be defined by the tongue of another. Ladies and gentlemen, the team making this video warmly greets you. I share this opening with you, not just as a piece of news, but as a reflection on what it means to truly break free. The world is full of nations that call themselves independent, yet still kneel to the invisible weight of the past. Burkina Faso may be small, but in this act it has shown a strength larger than many great powers. And so I invite you to stay with me until the very end of this video, because what begins as the story of a young president and a single language may in fact be the first spark of a larger fire, one that could transform not just a country, but an entire continent. You do not want to miss where this story leads. If you find this journey worth exploring, I ask you to support this channel. Please subscribe so we can continue to bring you powerful stories, deep analysis, and insights that go beyond the headlines. Your support gives us the strength to keep making videos that reveal the truths many ignore. Together, let us follow this story to its end and perhaps discover what it truly means to be free. When news first broke that Burkina Faso had officially removed French from its place as the national language, the world was stunned. It was not simply a bureaucratic shift. It was a bold declaration made by a leader barely into his late 30s. For over 120 years, French had been the language that defined the courts, the schools, the laws, and even the most ordinary conversations of everyday life. Then, almost overnight, it was stripped of its crown and pushed aside to the position of a secondary foreign language. At first glance, some might shrug and say, this is just about words, just about communication. But if you look closer, you begin to see that this decision carries far more weight. It is about history, about power, about reclaiming what was lost for more than a century. Here is where the story takes a sharp turn. The real hook is not in the announcement itself, but in the numbers that sit quietly behind it. Once France withdrew and the state began managing its own resources more directly, Burkina Faso started to earn nearly $19 billion a year from mining and mineral wealth. $19 billion in a single year. That number should shake anyone awake, because the question that follows is haunting. If this nation can generate that much on its own in 1 year, how much wealth slipped away over the course of more than 120 years of foreign control? Trillions of dollars, perhaps. And if so, then this decision is not just about cultural pride. It is about confronting a staggering economic truth that has been hiding in plain sight. But what fascinates me most is not the money. It is the perspective behind the act. Many leaders in Africa have spoken about independence, sovereignty, and the right to self-determination. Yet they stopped short of tackling the symbols that truly define dependence. They left French as the national language. They left the reminder of colonial rule carved deep into the heart of their nations. Ibrahim Traoré did not. He chose to confront the symbol head-on, and in doing so, he created a shockwave that traveled far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. This is the unique angle that people often overlook. Language is not just a tool. It is a mirror of identity. For Burkina Faso, French was a constant reminder that independence was unfinished business. Even after official independence in 1960, the colonial structure lived on in the very words citizens spoke every day. That kind of influence is subtle, but it shapes the way a nation sees itself. By cutting French down to the level of a foreign language, Traoré sent a message that the old ties no longer define the people. It was less about erasing the language itself and more about reclaiming the dignity that comes with choosing what voice a nation speaks in. Critics will argue that French has advantages in diplomacy, science, and global communication. And they are not wrong, but they miss the deeper meaning. This act was never about shutting out the world. It was about declaring to his own citizens that their mother tongues matter, that their culture has weight, and that they no longer need to measure themselves against the standards of a former empire. From my perspective, that is a statement that resonates with any people who have ever fought for freedom. It touches on pride, on identity, on the belief that one can walk into the future without carrying the baggage of the past. When I reflect on this, I cannot help but compare it to other moments in history when nations made bold, symbolic choices that shifted their destiny. Think about the times when oppressed people tore down monuments, changed flags, or rewrote constitutions. These moments may seem small on the surface, but they mark turning points that echo for generations. Burkina Faso's decision belongs in that same category. It is a moment that says, loudly and clearly, that the time of living under someone else's shadow is over. And that is what makes this story so gripping. It is not only about one country, or one leader, or one decision. It is about what happens when a society dares to rewrite its story in its own words. By stripping away a language imposed from outside, they are laying the foundation for a future written in their own voice. Whether this experiment will succeed or stumble is a question for the coming years. But right now, in this moment, it is a powerful statement that challenges the very assumptions of what independence truly means. Stay with me, because this is just the beginning. The deeper layers of this decision will take us through history, politics, economics, and the hidden struggles of identity. The story does not end with the removal of French. It begins there. And as we move forward, we will uncover how this one act could reshape not only Burkina Faso, but the entire balance of power in Africa. Picture a classroom in Ouagadougou many decades ago. The children sit upright, pencils in hand, but the words they write are not the words of their mothers or fathers. Every lesson is dictated in French, every textbook printed in French, every exam written in French. The children may speak more or Diola at home, but inside the walls of school, those voices are silenced. Imagine growing up that way, knowing that the very language of learning is not your own. It seeps into your mind, convincing you that knowledge, power, and progress can only come through a foreign tongue. For more than 120 years, this was the reality of Burkina Faso. Now picture the same classroom today. The walls are the same, the desks still worn, but something profound has changed. The nation has declared that French will no longer dominate. For the first time, children may begin to see a path where their native languages are not shameful, but powerful, where their own heritage has a seat at the table. It is a small detail in appearance, yet it is monumental in meaning. A shift like this transforms identity from the ground up. This is why I see the decision as more than politics. It is a story of breaking free from a shadow. Every society carries the echoes of its past. And in the case of Burkina Faso, the French language was an echo that never stopped reverberating. Even after official independence in 1960, the sound of that echo shaped the laws, the universities, the courts, the news, even the way people prayed. It was as if the country had walked out of the prison gates but still carried the chains around its neck. And then one day, a young leader dared to say enough. The power of that moment reminds me of other chapters in history. When nations decide to throw off the remnants of colonization, it often begins with something symbolic but deeply emotional. Think of when India reclaimed its names for cities, when South Africa remade its national anthem, when Vietnam cast off the French tricolor for its own flag. These were not just gestures. They were acts of healing, ways of saying to the people that they no longer needed to define themselves by their oppressors. What Traoré did with language is cut from the same cloth. There is another layer to the story. For generations, French was not only a means of communication, but a marker of class. Those who spoke it fluently were seen as educated, superior, closer to authority. Those who struggled with it were marginalized, kept at a distance from power. This is how colonial influence survives long after soldiers have gone home. It hides in the hierarchy of language. By demoting French to a foreign status, Burkina Faso has begun to dismantle that hierarchy. The message is clear. The measure of intelligence or worth will no longer be tied to how well you imitate the words of Paris. I cannot help but draw a parallel to my own experience reading history. Whenever a nation reclaims its voice, something remarkable happens. It is as if the people stand taller, breathe deeper, and see themselves not as inheritors of someone else's destiny, but as authors of their own. Language becomes the bridge to dignity. And that is exactly what is unfolding now in this small West African country. Some will call this romantic, but I believe it is grounded in reality. We have already seen the economic side with the $19 billion of revenue after France's departure. But numbers alone do not stir the soul. Stories do. When a child can speak their native tongue in school without fear of being looked down on, that is a story of empowerment. When an elder hears government officials address the people in local languages rather than a colonial one, that is a story of belonging. And when a president stands before the world and refuses to let his nation be defined by its past chains, that is a story of courage. This story is not over. It is just beginning. The echoes of the past are fading, replaced by the sound of new voices rising. And as I reflect on this, I see clearly that this is not simply Burkina Faso's story. It is part of a larger human story, a story of people everywhere who have dared to break away from the imposed narratives of others and reclaim their right to speak, to think, to dream in their own words. That is why this decision is so gripping. It paints a picture not of loss, but of rediscovery. And in that rediscovery lies the promise of a future no longer chained to the ghosts of the past. Every bold decision in history carries two sides, and the removal of French as the national language of Burkina Faso is no exception. On one hand, supporters celebrate it as a long overdue declaration of independence, a refusal to keep bowing before symbols of colonial rule. On the other hand, critics warn that it could plunge the nation into confusion, disrupt education, complicate diplomacy, and slow down development. The clash between these two perspectives is what makes this story so gripping. Let us begin with the arguments of those who support the move. They point out that the timing could not be more fitting. France is deeply occupied with challenges in Europe, and its grip on Africa is weaker than it has been in decades. For Burkina Faso, this is the perfect window to assert its sovereignty loudly and clearly. To delay any longer would risk letting the opportunity slip away. Supporters also argue that no true independence can exist if the very language of daily governance is that of a former colonizer. To them, the decision is not reckless at all. It is an act of courage, a step toward finally closing the chapter of dependency. But then come the critics, and their concerns are not without substance. They argue that a language is not just a tool for communication, but a framework that carries legal systems, academic traditions, and global connections. French has been deeply rooted in Burkina Faso's institutions for more than a century. Removing it from the central stage, they claim, could disrupt everything from court proceedings to international trade agreements. Imagine rewriting entire libraries of legal codes, retraining judges, rewriting textbooks, or teaching doctors in languages that have limited scientific vocabulary. The critics say the decision risks chaos in systems that are already fragile. They caution that instead of progress, the nation could find itself stumbling. This tension between pride and practicality is the heart of the debate. And here is where the story reaches its most dramatic point. The truth is that both sides are correct, but they are looking at different timelines. In the short term, there will indeed be confusion. Shifting away from a language that has dominated every part of public life will cause friction. Students may struggle, officials may make mistakes, and the machinery of state could slow down. But in the long term, the benefits may outweigh the costs. Creating a generation that grows up speaking and learning in its own tongue builds confidence, dignity, and cultural strength. That foundation can last far longer than the pain of short-term adjustments. To me, the most shocking revelation is that the decision was never about erasing French completely. Many headlines made it sound like Burkina Faso had banned the language outright. That is not true. French will still exist, but as a foreign language, not as the heart of the nation. This distinction is crucial. It means the government has created a symbolic break without fully dismantling the tools that still have practical value. In other words, they staged a political earthquake that shook the world, but they left enough scaffolding to prevent the building from collapsing. That is strategy, not recklessness. And yet, what really gives me pause is this. Why did no one else dare to make such a move before? Many African nations continue to operate with French as their official language, tied financially to systems like the CFA currency that keep them tethered to Paris. Leaders often say they want freedom, but they avoid touching these deep symbols. They fear the backlash, the uncertainty, the unknown. Traoré did not. He was willing to step into the fire. That alone speaks volumes about his political courage and his willingness to risk personal reputation for the promise of a different future. This is the climax of the story. It is not just about whether Burkina Faso succeeds or fails in the practical sense. It is about the message that a small, struggling country can stand up and say no more, even when logic and caution scream otherwise. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Do nations remain trapped because they genuinely cannot escape, or because they choose not to test the chains that bind them? Are these chains made of steel, or are they only illusions that dissolve the moment someone dares to tug hard enough? As I reflect on these questions, I realize this moment is larger than Burkina Faso. It is about confronting the ghosts of colonialism, the subtle but powerful reminders that independence is never truly complete until the symbols of subjugation are stripped away. The debate between chaos and courage, between risk and reward, is what keeps us on the edge of our seats. And that is exactly why this story is far from over. It is a battle of narratives, a clash between fear of collapse and hunger for dignity. One thing is certain: whatever the outcome, this bold move has already altered the course of history.